Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Grey Fox Latin Teacher podcast. I am Kostas, and I am back once again, without fail, with my partner in crime, Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
Hey there, Kostas. It is always great to be back and to be talking to you about issues related to teaching Latin.
Yeah, and how are you doing today? How's your day been going?
Oh, it's been all right. I think every day that we record the podcast is a good day. You know what? People don't know this, but we do this at night, pretty late at night, and it's a great end to a day, a great end to a Monday.
Yeah, I'm having a fantastic day, and it's only made better by the fact that we get to discuss these hard-hitting topics that are of so much interest to the Latin teaching community. And boy, do we have another whopper of a topic here tonight, because the title of this show... What was that?
This one's a doozy.
It sure
Absolutely.
is. Even the title's a mouthful. So this is Conversational Latin and the popularity of a school's Latin program. So as you can tell from that title, there's several different angles that we're going to be touching on here today. Maybe we should start with the fact, or the assertion, perhaps we might say, that Latin is becoming less popular. First of all, Andrew, do you agree with this? And if so, why do you suppose this may be happening?
Well, there's no question that that's been happening for a long time, that for several decades in America, Latin is becoming has become less and less popular in schools, whether it's high schools or grade schools or universities. It's just become less and less popular. And I mean, that's a fact. And I think most people see that happening because so many schools drop their Latin programs. I know that my high school did when I was there.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Then that was a long time ago.
Yeah, that's why I'm a little surprised by that. So yeah, this is going back a little bit at least, and they dropped it while you were there. So you didn't get to complete your. Well, actually, you've told us before. I think you didn't start taking Latin until college, right?
No, I started in high school, but the Latin I had in high school was pretty much useless because I started in the second year of Latin. And the reason I started in the second year is that they'd eliminated the program that year. So there was no first year of Latin. So I went straight to the second. And because I didn't have the fundamentals down, I never really knew what I was doing. I was really lost throughout high school. And I know I'm not the only student who's experienced that because there is a severe lack of consistency in the Latin program at a lot of schools.
But we'll be touching on this a little bit later, talking about foundations. But I'm just wondering what goes through the minds of an administration that thinks that you can just start with the second year of a language without having the basics in place.
Well, I don't think they cared that much, and my parents really wanted me to take Latin, so they decided this would be all right. I mean, you can't see this, but I'm using finger quotes. I learned the first year, the summer before my freshman year of high school, but I did not learn it well. And so it was very difficult after that. But fortunately, when I got to college, I started over again. And the second time around, I did learn it. It was great that I had a really good Latin teacher that first year, Ken Kroll, at Gonzaga University. Who was a great teacher, a very effective teacher of the first year of Latin. And because I had that foundation, I was able to move forward from there. Now, it's been a journey of many years, and unfortunately, I wouldn't say that my education was perfect. And, that's why I've That's why I don't teach exactly the same way that I learned the language, because over the years I really saw the deficiencies in that. But anyway, I'm going off on a long tangent here, but we were talking about why is Latin becoming less popular? If you talk to the guy on the street, Kostas, what he would say immediately is that it's becoming less popular because people think it's useless. Hmm. He would say, no, nobody wants to take Latin. They want to take Spanish or Chinese because those are useful. Right. I mean, what do you think about that, Kostas?
Well, I don't agree with that at all. And, you know, you and I have strong opinions about this, really strong, virulent opinions that hopefully we're going to put out here for everyone else to share in as well. This is just entirely illogical to me. And I think it's that way because, I mean, let's face it, most Americans really don't think any foreign language is useful. They think most of them are useless. And so as a result of that, they're not very serious about learning them.
Yeah, there's no logic to this. This is just one of those bits of, again, air quotes, common wisdom. And, you know, our brains are hardwired to believe something if we hear it enough times. And we don't need any proof. It doesn't have to have anything to do with reality. But if you hear it enough, boy, you're going to believe that and defend it because that's what everybody around you has said. And this is an example of something that doesn't really make any sense for the reason you said, Kostas. In fact, Americans don't care about any foreign language. And it's extremely rare that there's a serious foreign language program at any school. They have foreign languages, but really in America, they're not serious about teaching them. So that argument that people think Latin is useless would only make sense if Americans felt any other language was useful. Exactly. But in fact, they clearly don't.
And let's have a little point of comparison here with what's going on in Europe, in particular in the Scandinavian countries. And I've spoken to many people actually from the country of Finland through some other business ventures of mine who we've had conversations about the importance that they place on Latin over there. And it's night and day compared to what happens here. It's looked at in a completely different manner. And as a result, popularity isn't waning over there. Popularity is as high as it's ever been in Europe for Latin.
Yeah, there's no reason that Latin should be unpopular. There are reasons why it is unpopular, and we want to get into those. It's not because people think it's useless. In fact, if you go to any school, Kostas, I don't care what the school is, you're going to have multiple foreign language departments in competition with each other. Mm-hmm. They're going to be in competition for the students because the students can choose which language they want to learn. And no matter what school you go to, the most popular foreign language program will be the one that has the teacher who's most effective and most charismatic. Yeah. I mean, this has always been my experience. I mean, do you disagree with that, Kostas?
No, I mean, that has absolutely been my experience also. And as I've spoken about many times, again, my high school teacher, Mrs. Paternoster, was very popular. We actually got to the point during my time in high school when they were having trouble squeezing everybody in, fitting the enrollment in, and there were about 4 different classes at that point. And it was because she was such an excellent teacher and very charismatic, and everybody wanted to take the class, even if they didn't have any interest in Latin otherwise. They just wanted to be a part of something that was really fun, a really good language experience. And there were some other teachers as well. I remember a couple of Spanish teachers who were like that also, but there's no way in the world that the Latin program in my high school would have been as popular as it was without Mrs. Paternoster being at the head of it. And not only can I say that because of how wonderful she was, but the person who came in after her was not her, just to be kind. I'll say that. And so it began to suffer as a result of her not being there anymore. She retired. And yeah, I can tell you absolutely up front that those two things make the most difference.
Right. So, now we're kind of flirting with the conclusion that a lot of teachers may not want to hear, but that
That's okay. We go there.
right. But Kostas, you and I both think that the reason Latin has become less and less popular is in fact due to the teaching. Now, I want to make a distinction. I'm not saying it's the teacher's fault, but it's the fault of the teaching. It's the fault of the way that the language is taught.
Yes.
And if it were taught differently, things would be different. But the approach that's generally used today in America still, although things are starting to change, is not terribly effective when it comes to teaching the students and really giving the students a good facility with the language. But the other part of it is just not, it makes Latin really boring. And there's no reason that Latin has to be boring.
No. No, I was going to say, I mean, if anything, it should be even more popular because there's so much else that comes with Latin, all of this history and literature.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I really do think in most cases, the students are not being served well. And this is, again, this comes back to my point about the varying popularity of different language programs at a school. The students gravitate very quickly to the program that's the most interesting and the most fun. And it's that way because of the teacher or teachers who are in that particular language program. And so it's absolutely possible for an individual Latin teacher to grow the Latin program at his or her school very rapidly. But it just means maybe, depending on the teacher, changing the approach a little bit, I think.
Yeah. And of course, you run up against this idea that Latin is boring. And of course, it's useless, as we talked about a few minutes ago. And this really just comes down to nothing more than people repeating something that they've heard over and over again, regardless of whether it's true or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you just have to open your eyes and look at what's happening to, in fact, see that the power is in the hands of the individual Latin teacher to affect real change. Now, what is what's the issue, Kostas? So, I guess that's my question for you. And I've got an answer, but I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. Why are Latin programs maybe not that popular at certain schools? And why might that come back to the teacher?
Well, I mean, as we just talked about, of course, the teaching has to be on point, effective, and charismatic. And in many cases, that isn't what's going on. And it's the methodology that's involved. It's the way the language is taught. And so you have this, we've said this before, this 20th century approach where everything is done in such a way that it's just all grammars, vocabulary lists, things like this that just don't connect with students on a real level. If the students are going to learn the language well, they have to learn it on a level that makes it real for them.
Absolutely. It can't be math. I've said this many times in the past, Latin is not math.
Exactly.
So let's not pretend it is. But, with the 20th century approach, that's pretty much what they make it. And you can't use a language that way. So, I mean, there are a few people, but most of us could not solve a math problem at the speed that we could utter a sentence in a
Right.
language. So you have a conversation very rapidly. Math problems are solved slowly and meticulously. So I don't think that really fits. I think that that's a wrong turn, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as always, we have our own ideas about things, and hopefully you will at least have your minds open and enlightened to some of those things as we get a little further along the program here. Right now, we're going to take a short break for a message from Grey Fox Tutors, but when we come back, we've got lots more to talk about, including what our ideas are about how to spruce up and spice up a Latin program so that you don't run into these problems about ineffectiveness and lack of charisma. So we'll get to that in just a moment. We'll be right back right after this. The Grey Fox Latin Teacher Facebook group is open to all current, former, or prospective Latin teachers. The group is a place for Latin teachers to discuss matters related to the Latin language, teaching Latin, and classics in general. The Grey Fox group is open only to Latin teachers. The goal of the Grey Fox Latin Teacher Facebook group is to give teachers a chance to interact with other Latin and Greek teachers in a safe environment. Because it's a closed group, teachers can discuss assignments without worrying that students or parents may be looking in. In addition, the Grey Fox Forum gives Latin teachers a chance to interact with their colleagues across the United States and around the world. The group is moderated by Grey Fox administrators, and all posts are relevant to Latin and Greek pedagogy. Teachers post announcements and links about classics events and resources, ask the group questions about teaching, and share their own experiences and successes as Latin educators. To join the Grey Fox Facebook group, just search for Grey Fox Latin Teacher Forum on Facebook. Click the Join button and answer the question that verifies you are a Latin teacher. For more information or any questions, please contact us at info@greyfoxtutors.com. That's info@greyfoxtutors.com. Okay, we're back. And before the break, we talked about the different reasons for the unpopularity of a Latin program and why that is and what possibly could be done to ameliorate that. And by the way, there's your vocabulary word of the day. I've got to get a Latin word in there always. So ameliorate.
It's a very nice word. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, Andrew, you have devised a fantastic method to combat the issues that exist that often Latin teachers find themselves that they're faced with in these particular problems that come up that we just spent all this time talking about. So what have we done to go against this and make Latin fun and effective and not boring?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that I haven't actually devised a method at all. All I've done...
He's so modest, people.
I've just gone back before the 20th century. So
you had a time machine.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a time machine, but I certainly have been able to see back into the past by talking to different people, talking to different Latin teachers. And it became clear to me at a certain point that, and I mean, we call it the 20th century approach because it's something that's really only existed in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Before that, Latin wasn't taught in this way. It would vary, but it was generally taught in the way that we teach it. And that way is, on the one hand, teaching the students grammar and translation, teaching them exactly how a Latin sentence works. But then side by side with that, teaching the students how to speak the language. I remember the first time it occurred to me that the way I'd always been taught Latin was actually very odd if you looked at the entire history of Latin instruction. And I think I was in my very early 20s at the time. I had just graduated from college, and I was actually at that time in the summer Greek program at UC Berkeley. Which I got to tell, I mean, just as an aside, I don't recommend that. So,
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you what it was like, but
well,
thanks for sharing.
it went extremely quickly. So I mean, that's a topic for another day. And in fact, I think we
Okay.
should have a show on that, on why the pace of instruction is so important.
I will make a note
Uh,
of that.
yeah, that, it's important not to go too quickly or too slowly with students, but that went much too quickly. I was in the summer Greek program. Half the students dropped out before the end. Um, and I was so sick of Greek by the end of that I put the books down and I didn't do anything for many months. And then when I picked them up again, I'd forgotten everything. So, not, I think, a terribly effective way to do it. But anyway,
No.
I was actually staying with my uncle and aunt at the time. And we were talking about Latin. And I was just sort of talking about, how I had learned it and everything. And for some reason, the topic of speaking it came up. And my uncle said, "Oh yeah, I guess they don't usually speak it in the Latin classes anymore." And I kind of I shook my head and I said, "What are you talking about? They used to speak it?"
Yeah, anymore?
and
My ears would have
and he
perked up
said,
at that word.
soon after that, I learned that in fact it wasn't that long ago that they were doing that.
Yeah.
He said, well, before Vatican II, the priests would have some of their classes entirely in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And they did that up until the 60s. So it wasn't that long ago that they were doing this. They were learning the grammar, but then speaking it as much as they could.
Yeah.
They
It's
were,
interesting, actually.
yeah.
I was just going to inject a little side note to this. When I was looking for colleges, both were Catholic universities, the two that I was choosing between. And the one that I did not end up going to, I spoke to a number of Jesuit priests, and they were talking about the way things used to be with the Latin Mass and how things had changed so much. And we got into really long conversations about this and talking about the way that Latin was taught versus the way it was being taught at the time when I was entering into college. And yeah, I mean, I can absolutely verify what you're saying, the way that things changed for whatever reason.
Well, yeah. So I think often of the Jesuit priests who taught me and how they actually learned it very differently from the way they taught it to me.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was there was just this wave of change in this, and everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And somebody decided, I don't know, some guy who was supposed to be a smart guy way back when, I don't know, turn of the century, decided it's silly the way they're doing it. Let's change it. This makes more sense. This is more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And then for whatever reason, his articles got published. I don't know who this guy is. I'm just making him up, but it has to start somewhere.
Mr. X, we'll call him.
Yeah, Mr. X. And then over time, because it was the way things were going, everybody started doing it. I mean, it makes me think of what's that movie? Goodbye, Mr. Chips.
Yes.
And he was part of the older generation. He came out of the 19th century, and the people at the school who ran the school said, no, you can't teach Latin this way anymore. You're going to do it in the new way. This is the way they're doing it now. And because they were going to fire him, he finally went along with it.
By the way, for all you old Hollywood film buffs, one of Robert Donat's finest performances, if I do say so myself.
I think it. Well, I've always enjoyed that movie, and I guess it's because of that movie that we've had all these other movies where a teacher comes in and changes the students' lives.
Yes. It's sort of an accepted motif, I think, in
Right,
script
but
writing
this
now.
one's our favorite because he's a Latin teacher.
Exactly.
Uh, so what we're
Yes.
getting at, and this is we're going at it in a very roundabout way, but we have found that the most effective way to teach Latin is this combined approach. So you teach the students grammar, you teach them translation, you make sure that they know exactly how a Latin sentence works, and you have to because Latin is so different from English. These sentences are set up in such a different way. They need to be taught that. At least older students need to be. Younger students are a different story.
Right.
But students over about 10 years old need to be taught the grammar in that way. But then, as soon as possible, as soon as they're at the point where they have a good grasp of enough grammar so that they can construct simple sentences, they should start using the language conversationally in the same way that the Jesuits did it. Those priests got so good at Latin and were able to speak it fluently because they spoke it,
Yeah.
because it was part of their everyday lives. And Latin is no different from any other language. That's how you get good at a language. You use the language conversationally. So we found, from our own experience, that this is the most effective method. And so we really push that.
Yeah.
Now, Kostas, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I was just about to say, what's the building block, or what are the building blocks of a language? The vocabulary. And conversation is undeniably the best way to learn vocabulary. And,
Absolutely.
we've said this many times, but it's almost absurd. It really does border on absurd to expect students to learn the vocabulary of a language by memorizing a long list. It's just impractical.
Doesn't work.
You have to make use of the words in their natural environment. You have to speak the language in order to get the most out of it. Learn the words, and not only do you learn them, but then they take on a life for the student. They take on meaning for the student. They become relevant to the student. Without this, there is this giant disconnect that exists between the student and the language itself. There's this gap there.
Yeah, well, and what you're getting at also is that while on the one hand, this just works better and is more effective, Latin is also so much more fun when the students get to speak it. So much more fun. I mean, I can tell you that in our classes, if students have been with us for a few years and we ask them what their favorite part of the Latin classes was, they almost always, I mean, very close to 100% of the time, say speaking it, say the conversational Latin part of it, because that makes the language live. And this is what people really want. They want to experience a language in that living way. And unfortunately, most of the time, they don't have the opportunity to do that. Now, why is it that so many teachers don't integrate conversational Latin into their curriculum? I mean, I would say the number one reason is just they've never done it. So,
and this actually goes back to, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, this actually goes back to our episode from last week when we were talking about fears of speaking Latin. And one of the great reasons for fear is a lack of experience and not having learned it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they never did it. And I never did. I mean, I came to conversational Latin quite late, and it was a real epiphany when I discovered it, and I discovered how much fun it was and how it allowed me to learn vocabulary so effectively. I was really shocked, and I said to myself, why has nobody told me about this all these years? It just worked so well that it amazed me that none of the teachers had actually made us speak it at all.
Yeah.
But I mean, clearly just kind of inertia. I was taught this way, so this is the way I have to teach it. There's that. I think also in a lot of instances, teachers have a fear that they just don't have any time, that they have a curriculum, they have to get through the textbook, they have to get through the curriculum in a certain period of time. They have no extra time to add this in. They can't do it. And some may even think if I did integrate conversational Latin, that maybe the administration wouldn't like it. I mean, that's a possibility.
That's very valid, yeah.
Although I would say in most instances that won't be the case. And the reason why is that the administration normally knows nothing about Latin and is not in a position to evaluate the teachers. The administrators want the teacher to get through the curriculum in time, absolutely, and they can measure that. But beyond that, in most cases, Latin teachers have the freedom to add other things in. And I would really encourage teachers to add conversational Latin into their curriculum. And in fact, they may make the assumption that if they take time on this, that will make them less efficient. But if you do it correctly, it'll make you more efficient.
Yeah.
Because the students will learn Latin more quickly, and when they learn it, they won't forget it. The practice really makes a huge difference, the conversational practice. What do you think, Kostas?
Oh, I agree with everything you're saying. And it's interesting, just as you're telling these stories, I'm having flashbacks of my own. And I think last week on the show I had mentioned that I actually was quite fortunate to have been able to partake in some conversational Latin with my high school Latin teacher. And it was counterintuitive to me that you wouldn't speak the language. It just was something that I couldn't accept. And looking back on it now, there's no way I ever would have learned the language as well as I did without speaking it. And what I was thinking of tonight was she had this bumper sticker on the front of her desk, and it said something along the lines of, it had some different things, and I think it said, Dice Latine, Doce Latine, Loquere Latine. And that always stuck with me. And, you know, there aren't too many people that I've run into who are in the Latin teaching profession or otherwise who have ever really been that adamant about it, at least until you and I have started being more adamant about it. But that's interesting sometimes, the things that you remember from talking like this. Anyhow, we were talking, of course, about the fears that are involved in this. And what about this idea that exists that's, you know, certain students only take Latin because they don't have to speak it?
Well, so a couple things. You said that when you started Latin, it never made sense to you that you wouldn't speak it.
Right.
Well, my experience is that that's how it is for most students. In fact, all students. And I know that because we have conversational Latin as an aspect of our curriculum and our tutoring, and we really integrate it as much as we possibly can anywhere. And I've never had a student or a parent ask why that was happening. So that could just be due to absolute ignorance of Latin. But I mean, it never surprises them that the student will be speaking it. It never surprises them. because they think, oh, well, yeah, that's what you do with the language. That's what the student would do with Spanish or with French, of course. It's not some big shock to them. Now, I would say that this thing with this idea that a lot of students take Latin because they don't have to speak it, that's one of these ideas that becomes true if people say it enough times.
Yeah.
Because, and also if you continue to push the idea that Latin is not spoken, then you do give students the idea that Latin is a language that is not spoken and other languages are languages that are spoken. And then what can happen in that situation is certain students, and I would say that this is actually a minority of students, will gravitate toward Latin for that reason. But then many more students will move away from Latin for the same reason.
Yes, and if I may be so bold as to say, it delegitimizes the language, in my view, doing that.
Absolutely. Well, it just turns it into an exercise rather than a language.
Right.
And do people really want to learn an exercise? Well, maybe. I mean, I suppose that's what math is. And, the issue is that Latin is in so many places taught as if it were math, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, does that make sense to you?
It makes no sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, because math problem takes a long time. I mean, you got to take a long time to go through a math problem. But when you're speaking to somebody, you got to move fast.
Right.
So there has to be a different part of your brain working on the language. And if you want to really know Latin well, let's say you don't ever want to speak it to anybody. Let's say that's not your goal. And you get a lot of people like this. They say, well, all I want to do is read. I just want to read Latin. Well, my response to that is you will never read Latin quickly unless you can already speak Latin.
Right.
Because speaking is kind of, I would call it sort of the pinnacle of a language. It's the thing that requires the most practice to do well.
Yeah.
But, if you can't do that, I mean, the thing about it, though, is it's the pinnacle, but at the same time, nothing else happens without it.
Yeah, but that's just it. To learn a language effectively, it's not an a la carte system. You can't just pick and choose what you want to do. Exactly. If you really want to learn the language, you've got to do it completely.
That's right. That's a great way of putting it. And I think that a lot of teachers and administrators have had that idea that you can treat it in an a la carte fashion. But you can't. You have to do everything. It all goes together. And so if you're interested in reading Latin effectively, or you might say, well, I don't want to speak it. I just want to write it. I've run into students who just want to write it. I mean, I had one student, and one of his hobbies was writing Latin Wikipedia pages. And in that case as well, he's not going to be able to write it effectively unless he can speak it effectively. It all goes together, as you said, Kostas.
I have a little personal anecdote to add to this too. I mean, I sort of went through this myself with the French language. I was learning it on my own, really just sort of reading out of books, and just something was missing for me because I wasn't speaking it with anyone. I wasn't conversing. I wasn't hearing the sound of the language. I knew that I just wasn't getting the full experience. So I ended up taking it one summer in college, and I took the equivalent of several years over one summer. And while, that may or may not be the best thing to do, as we were talking about earlier with the pace of the instruction, it made a huge difference to me because I was able to be there with a real live French person and converse in the language and learn how to speak it, learn how it sounds, using it in conversation, made a tremendous difference. And I realized I didn't know hardly anything before.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a big issue with Latin, isn't it? Normally when people learn a modern language, the ideal is for them to find a teacher who's a native speaker of the language.
Yes.
Because then, I wouldn't say that that's always what needs to happen. I would say that non-native speakers can teach languages very well and be very effective. I mean, just because it wasn't your first language, that doesn't mean you can't be an advanced speaker of the language. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, there are very few Latin teachers who are even advanced speakers of the language. Yeah. So they're not even one down from a native speaker. And, I think that's a real issue. And I think when we talk about why student numbers are dwindling, it comes back to this. It comes back to the approach. It comes back to the fact that the teachers were taught in a way that wasn't terribly effective. And so they're usually not in a position to teach the language as effectively as they could teach it. But I want to say at the same time, that doesn't mean that a teacher can't learn how to do that. Absolutely. Can't learn how to become fluent in the language, can't learn how to teach students more effectively how to teach, how to speak and understand the Latin language. And there's one other point I want to make. So it isn't just that using this combined approach, which, as we've said, is just sort of the normal way of doing it, except for the 20th century. It's not just because that's more effective at teaching the students. The other reason why using this approach will increase student numbers rapidly is that it's so much more fun. So it's both of those things. It's effectiveness and it's also fun. It's the living aspect of the language that most people, and of course, there may be a few exceptions. There may be people who are so afraid of speaking a language that they will avoid that at all costs. But that's not the case most of the time. And I would argue that a lot of that fear that you hear certain Latin teachers talk about of speaking the language is something that's been created in the minds of the students.
Yeah. Well, people want to go where the fun is. And, I can tell you this with absolute certainty, and please know what I'm about to say. I don't say with any hint of egotism or in some sort of conceited way, but the fact that I was having so much fun learning the Latin language the way that I did when I was in my high school class is rubbed off on my classmates. I mean, I could tell. They were interested in learning words and speaking the language themselves and looking things up and just becoming involved with it in ways that I don't imagine they would have otherwise if I hadn't been having as much fun as I was having.
Absolutely. I mean, you can think back to high school and remember the classes that were a lot of fun and then the classes that were not very much fun. And the classes, I can tell you, the classes I really enjoyed were classes in which there was a lot of back and forth.
Yeah.
And these might have been history classes or, they could have been other classes as well, but there was discussion, there was back and forth between the teacher and students and among the students. And of course, you don't want anarchy in the classroom. I'm not advocating that, but I'm not advocating chaos. But what I'm saying is that when there's that sort of back and forth and involvement, the students get excited and interested in what they're doing, and they want to come back to the class. They enjoy the class. They love the class. And not just that. And I mean, you've had this experience, Kostas. They love the teacher.
Hmm.
And, I'm going to bet there are a lot of teachers out there who would like to be loved more than they are.
We all just want to be loved.
Yeah. Well, if you're a teacher, you want to teach and you want to be appreciated. But my argument is that a lot of that is in the hands of the teacher. There are choices that can be made by the teacher that will change a lot of these things, that will change how well the students are learning the language, that will change how much the students enjoy the class, and will also change how much the students appreciate the teacher.
Yeah. So I think what we're saying here is if these fears, these ideas are ever going to be overcome, there needs to be good teaching. And I'm going to be bold again, and I'm going to say not just good teaching, but authentic teaching, because I think a lot of the methodologies that are used now just aren't true to the language the way they need to be.
No, they don't make much sense to me. And I can understand why Latin went the direction it went, because if there are very few people who speak a language, then very quickly there becomes less and less interest in anybody speaking the language. And because those numbers were dwindling, I can understand why they decided, well, we don't want to speak it anymore. Because there aren't a lot of people speaking it. Nobody seems to be interested in that. But I'm also going to bet there was another part of it, that they probably were getting to the point where they weren't able to find fluent Latin teachers anymore. Not very often. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on this or anything. I'm making this up. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of the reason that they made this change. Of course, that's kind of nuts, because if you then change the system of teaching in this way, well, then of course there's going to be nobody who speaks it. So, I don't know. It's maybe it's a chicken and egg sort of thing. I don't know. I'm just guessing on this. I can only really talk with authority about what I've experienced over the years. And this is what I've experienced. I've tried a lot of different things, and I found that this combined approach, where you start just with grammar, you build the students up to the point where they're able to construct Latin sentences, then while you continue forward with grammar, at the same time, at that point, you start with conversation and you keep the students talking forever. Ideally, the students never stop conversing in the language, because that's the way to learn it. I mean, we've talked about this before. I can tell you from my personal experience, just with myself and my own Latin education, I did a lot of translation. And I could see a word, and I'm not exaggerating, 500 times and still not learn it.
Yeah.
That's not an exaggeration. I would just keep looking it up. I wouldn't be able to remember.
Yeah.
But the moment I started conversing in the language, I would have to use a word maybe 5 times, and I'd know it forever.
Exactly.
And that was all the proof I needed. I mean, as they say, the proof is in the pudding, and that was the pudding.
Yeah. And as we talked about at the beginning of the show here today, if you have a solid foundation, then that makes things so much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's no question you don't want to skip Latin 1. I don't recommend.
I wouldn't recommend that. I'm still a little bit aghast at that, but
yeah,
it worked out. It's all right.
A lot of things happen in the world that aren't ideal, and we just do the best with what we have. But anyway, that I think that's about all I have to say. Do you have any other final points you want to make, Kostas?
Yeah, so just to remind all of our listeners out there that if you like what you're hearing, and really, why wouldn't you? Please subscribe
Right.
to our podcast. We'd love it if you did. And also, in addition to subscribing, please check out our website at greyfoxtutors.com. That's GreyFoxTutors.com, where you can download free resources, including our conversation textbook that we've talked about before here on the show, and other materials and resources that we have for teachers. We have an entire wealth of these things, so go check it out.
These are resources that are aimed at Latin teachers, but also they can be great for Latin students as well, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, they work equally well for student and teacher, and there really is almost nothing that we haven't thought of at this point. But somehow we managed to keep adding new things. So keep checking in as we're constantly working on this stuff. And also, please interact with us and email us your questions and comments as well at podcast@greyfoxtutors.com. That's podcast@greyfoxtutors.com, and maybe we'll read one of your questions on the air. And if you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, please also click the subscribe button for the channel and then the little bell so that you get a notification when we put a new episode up each week. So this has been a great conversation today, Andrew. Thanks so much again for indulging me and talking to all our listeners about all of this.
We've explored a lot of different areas today. No question.
Absolutely have.
And as always, I had a great time doing it.
And I'm really excited about some of the shows we have coming up. And next week, when hopefully we'll have a special guest. So you'll definitely want to tune in for that. And lots of good things to come. So just want to say again, thank you to Andrew, and thank you to all of you who have been listening or watching or listening or whatever way you have consumed this today. Thank you so very much. And we will see you next time on the Grey Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Valete omnes.
Valete.